Right. A chahiirlach a úsalvéire, a chahiirlach an cóirla chunta agus a cháirte go léir. Is mór an chúis an órdom bheith an sa inniuh ag an cógáil speisialta, spéisiúil, simúil seo. Agus bhhailm buchas ó chrí a gháil le dan agus a chóibrithe as 8 curacha núldom teachtan sa. It is indeed a great honour for me to be here this afternoon with yourselves at this very special gathering. I've thanked Don and his collaborators for inviting me. I'm very glad to be back in Donegal, and I say back because I obviously don't sound like somebody from Donegal, but I have occasion to come here a few times a year because I teach geography, as Mary said, and I bring students on a field trip. And whether we're looking at tourism and heritage, or the landscape, or geology, or historical geography, we get everything we need in Donegal. And I'm very happy to do that, make that acknowledgement in the presence of Councillor Crossan, and to acknowledge the role and the support we get from Donegal County Council, and in particular your Heritage Officer, Joe Gallagher, in enabling that and in facilitating us in doing so. I also have occasion to come to the Northwest and to the border region as part of my work with the ICLRD, of which Tim, who spoke this morning, is the Honorary Chair. And in that role, I see the importance of the work that Mary and her colleagues in the North and South Ministerial Council are doing. They are creating the conditions that cement the peace process. They are creating the macro conditions that enable us to improve the quality of life for people right throughout this region, both North and South. And it's important that we acknowledge the work that Mary and her colleagues are doing on a continuous basis in a very quiet way in the background. The theme that I have been asked to talk about today is community and renewal. And we've heard a number of very uplifting papers today looking at the theme of renewal. And we've seen some great examples from the last two speakers of renewal, action. There's a real can-do attitude in this room all day today. And this morning, Suzanne, you referred to the landscape. That is an asset, a basis for renewal, a basis for development. Other speakers have referred to cultural assets or historical assets. Mr. Loftus, you referred to civil society in Montreal, and that's where I want to make the link with community and renewal. Tim talked about the diaspora, investment. Yes, that is part of the mix. And I want to acknowledge that, but to emphasize maybe the community development and the local aspect of it. We see there on the first slide some perceptions of Ireland, perceptions of the Irish from The Economist. So these are external perceptions of us, very much associated from the middle here with the Celtic Tiger period, and then later, at the height of the boom. Perception becomes a reality, and this became not just a perception, but a policy, an ethos, a set of values. And we now need to look at rediscovering new sets of values, new policies, new ways of doing business. And one of the ways we heard from Tim of doing new business is promoting the link between business and the arts and culture. And this organisation is doing that very effectively. But if we are to have a vision, we need to look at where we are now. We need to, what is our starting point? What is our baseline? And our baseline from this map, if you look here on the right, we can see that Ireland is there in a yellow colour, as is Portugal, as is Greece. And that's not the first time that we have been lumped in with those two countries. This map, the title is a little blocked out by the curtains there, it's state systems. It's the degree to which the state is centralised, the degree to which decisions are made in the capital city. So increasingly, or more under the Irish system, decisions that affect Buncrana and Inishowen and Muff and Moville are made in Dublin and not in Buncrana. And that's a feature of Portugal, a feature of Greece, a feature of many post-communist countries in Eastern Europe, but as you can see from the arrows there, they're reforming themselves. And when we were in receipt of European funding to a much larger extent than we are now. We ushered in some reforms of local government, bringing in regional authorities and regional assemblies. But we never gave them real power, unlike the federation system that we have in Canada. So there's a marked point of contrast there. So we have good ideas, we have creativity at a local level, but we don't have the power. And we haven't the ability to follow through on some of the good and some of the initiative that is there from the bottom up. And there's an opportunity in the north of Ireland with the review of public administration that is underway, that is restructuring local government in Northern Ireland to create systems that give more power to communities, that have a municipal tier of government like we have in most European countries. We have opportunities there. Because if we don't do it, we go back to the same cycle again. We may have a boom again. We may have prosperity. We probably will. They talk about, peaks and troughs. But what good is the boom if it doesn't improve the quality of life for people in communities? We get plenty of rain in Ireland, but we have poor water quality, even in the west of Ireland. So this economy needs to serve the needs of society. And some of the challenges that we're faced with at the moment, and if you look there in parts of West Donegal, you'll see some red on the map, the vacant houses. Then around Letterkenny here, you have a number of ghost estates. There's one in Buncrana. There's one further north in Carndonagh as well. These are some of the legacies of the boom. These are some of the legacies of a system that created wealth but didn't give power to communities. We need to change that. This is the type of landscape that we created. We need to change. This is where we're starting out from, in some senses. Our rural landscape, our towns and our villages being hollowed out, local shops closing, people going to the multiples to do their shopping. Meanwhile, the local supermarket, the local shop, the local pub is closing down. We can make choices that shape the future of our communities. And we need to have some of the vision that's in this room. We need to take that out into our daily lives and into the choices that we make. We need to look at our rural landscape. What roles does the landscape play? In the past, it was all about food production. But we've heard from this morning, it can be about the celebration of our culture. It attracts people. Celebrate our uniqueness. Yes, we do need, so there's some changes that happen in the landscape. Yes, we need development. We need a certain amount of construction. But this needs to be done in a balanced and in a sustainable way. And if it's going to be balanced and sustainable and long-lasting, local communities have to have their say. Because these are the people who, they're living with their environment, living in the local context. They want the best for their children. But they've been excluded to a large extent from the decision-making process, say voting every 4 or 5 years. There's a quotation there from an organisation with which I work sometimes, Limerick Civic Trust. And I'm not going to read it, but just to emphasise that, people, we all give out about, what should and shouldn't be done. We'd like to see certain improvements in our society. But what appealed to the group here was they recognised that local authorities and state agencies alone could not be relied on or couldn't, maybe don't have the resources, the expertise, the flexibility to deal with situations at a local level. So we had to do something for ourselves. And community action, bottom-up action, is strong in Ireland. It's undervalued. It's not recognised. It is the foundation stone for reform of local government. So we need to learn from the Montreal experience and so on and change our system. So we can see here some of the changes that have been effected in Limerick, a city with many social problems and challenges, by a voluntary organisation like the Civic Trust, the reform of the renewal of the city landscape and the built environment. Right throughout Ireland, we have local communities working through the LEADER programme, and indeed there's the Inishowen partnership in this area, delivering vital local services, things like rural transport, community care, retrofitting of homes to reduce their carbon footprint, providing local employment opportunities, reaching out to those in need, taking the pressure off some of the mainstream services, allowing people to live in their communities, live at home, upskill, promoting intergenerational learning. There's an awful lot of this happening in Ireland, but it's very much below the radar. It doesn't make the headlines. We hear so much of official Ireland, and we hear so much negativity. Well, this is what's really happening, and this is the powerhouse that we need to unleash. If you look at the statistics here, these are statistics, and they're an underrepresentation, because we all know that community groups, civil society, are under pressure. They rely on volunteers, and they tend to under-record their work. And in spite of that under-recording, we see almost 1.5 million people, and this is just in the south, benefiting from community services projects that are delivered by community and voluntary groups that are funded through the state agency Pobal. So that's a very, very sizable amount of activity, as I said, that is below the radar. And when we look at County Donegal, we see quite a healthy distribution of social economy projects in the county. These are figures exactly for this month. People of Greencastle up here in Inishowen can certainly take about 2 well-established community services projects, social economy projects. You can see there's quite a clustering of projects in North Donegal and in Inishowen in particular. And when I started out to do this map, I had no idea where the symbols would end up. And the old bureaucratic approach, somebody might look at that map and say, goodness, there's nothing happening in Letterkenny, we better do something about that. Whereas the more progressive approach will say, well, hats off to the people of Inishowen. They're proactive. They're providing community services. They're developing their local economy. Let's work with them. Let's reward good behaviour. We need to change that attitude in Ireland, and yes, reward good behaviour and work with communities that are doing something for themselves. The green dot for environment hasn't shown up on my slide. It's showing on this one here. So you can see there's quite a good distribution right throughout the rural in this respect. So community business, small business, indigenous business has a role to play in the renewal of the rural. Just as external investment has a role to play in economic development. But we need to be very, very careful about external investment in terms of the geography of it. If we look at IDA-supported companies in County Donegal, of which there are 10, it's much lower in the west of Ireland than it is in the east. And we hear an awful lot in Ireland about foreign direct investment, and we seem to be very protective of this 12.5% corporation tax, which is the biggest subsidy we're giving to the Greater Dublin area than you could possibly give, because it's attracting foreign direct investment to the area in the greater, the Dublin and the surrounding counties, and is putting Donegal and the West and so on at a disadvantage. And there's an awful lot of merit in what French President Sarkozy is saying, about small and medium-sized enterprises in Ireland subsidising some of the multinationals. And in Donegal, we have a clustering of the multinationals around Letterkenny. There's one here in Buncrana, and then 2 in the south of the county. It's particularly intrigued by the Mexican investment in County Donegal. It's a concrete company down in Leahy. I think they bought a local company. So there's just a particular geography. Yes, this is part of the mix, but official Ireland, we know who they are. Overemphasize this to the exclusion of what's happening in the community. Newfoundland has similar issues, and when I was at the conference of the North Atlantic Forum in Newfoundland in October, one of the most intriguing speakers was this lady here, Zita Cobb. Is working in the Fogo Island, which is their equivalent of Inishvigal, an island off an island. It's really up in the north of Newfoundland, and looking there at developing, using the landscape to attract in artists, to a very particular, unique environment. And I can guarantee you that these art studios, the local accommodation, the integration into the local landscape. That's going to be there in 50 years' time when the oil companies have left and packed up and gone. And right throughout Ireland, we see similar situations. Communities coming together, community gardens, allotments. People are motivated by ecology, green communities, green schools, arts that was mentioned today. We have increasing business networks in towns, collaboration, chambers of commerce right down to the more local level. The first transition town in Ireland, the first transition town actually in these islands is Kinsale in County Cork. We have a number of towns right throughout Ireland, and Buncrana can be one of these, that has a plan in place and has started to take measures to prepare us for a post-carbon scenario. Because in 20 years' time, there may not be oil. And if there is oil, it certainly won't be as cheap as $100 a barrel, because the amount of it is reduced. So a number of towns are ahead of the state, ahead of government, in preparing for that transition. So yes, communities are leading the way. And what's interesting, they're looking at their natural environment, the Geofest in my own county, a heritage park, several examples in Donegal. What's interesting about some of those that I've mentioned here, like the Cavan and Fermanagh Marble Arch Geopark, the Slieve Bay, Ring of Gullion, the Mourns, which is in a preparatory stage, a lot of those are cross-border, working between the north and the south, looking at the natural areas of development. Let the culture, let the local economy, let community define the boundaries of action, rather than strict administrative boundaries. We need to cut through an awful lot of that red tape. So when we look at Inishowen, we see healthy levels of community development, a number of groups. And if I were to put up that map, 40 years ago, when people thought, community in Ireland is in its heyday, and we have Muintir na Tíre and, Father MacDyer down in southwest Donegal and then Columkill doing Trojan work. We'd have seen a lot of community associations. But what we've seen over the last few years, last 20 years in particular, particularly with the partnerships and the leader groups and so on, is a new diversity in civil society, more family support groups, youth development, new ways in which people can participate in civil society. It's quite healthy in the case of Donegal, in the case of Inishowen. But when I look at this map, I get a little bit puzzled, because I thought I could see a very clear spatial pattern, and geographers were always looking for spatial patterns. This is from the 2006 census. There was a question on the census that asked people, whether you participate, whether you're a member of a voluntary organisation or not. And in Ireland, 16% of people say they're members of voluntary organisations. It's higher than the UK, but it's much lower than the European average. You have countries like the Netherlands, where the figure is at 80%. In Germany, it's up in the 60s and so on. And we can see that, the Greater Dublin area, some of the counties in the east and in the commuter belt, have lower levels of volunteerism. The west tends to have the highest, and Leitrim at almost 20%. So there's a slight anomaly in terms of where Donegal is positioned there. It doesn't add up for me, and all I can say is maybe there's a certain amount of modesty here, and people, don't recognise the fact that they're volunteering, or it's so ingrained in the culture that, asking it in a census form makes it a little bit official or whatever. But that figure is there. That's the one that's on the official record. It wasn't asked in the 2011 census, but it probably will be in the next one again. So there's just something for you to be aware of, so to speak. So this is what's happening at local level, and I'm trying to make the point that we need to translate what's happening at the local right up along, from the bottom up. That policy making is not the preserve of governments and the bureaucracy. Yes, they have a role. And if with people like Mary Bunting, we can be sure that we get good policy. It is shaped by popular pressure, by social groups, and community experience. And it's not the markets. It's not the media. It's not the people who are driving policy at the moment. It's about the political choices, about proposing alternatives. We need a radical change in terms of the power relationships. I've mentioned leader there as one of the drivers, one of the catalysts of civil society and community action. And I was involved in a study last year that did a 13-country evaluation of leader. And we talked about the opportunities emerging from the increased size of the budget to promote rural development. But we need to examine the long-term impacts, but too much of the time is spent taken up with bureaucracy. So community groups need to be freed from some of the shackles of the bureaucracy and the red tape that is stifling some of their creativity. And I very much welcome the new proposals that the European Union has published for the Interreg programme, particularly Articles 28 to 32 of the new guidelines. That's going to be very significant for Donegal because they talk about flexibility and they talk about reducing the administrative burden on community groups. We need to move away from this. Yes, we need accountability. Right? There's been accountability down to the local level and bureaucracy and all the rest of it. Meanwhile, banks and so on have gotten off scot-free. And there's the opportunity then to marry the work of civil society, the arts, and so on with business, as we heard this morning, but also, as Suzanne mentioned, with the environment, with the rural environment. Working to promote the Natura 2000 network. That is one of the greatest resources, our greatest assets that we have is our environment. We need to put a value on it. And we need to work with the farming community, with the farm organisations, in putting a new value on the rural landscape. We need a vision for Donegal, for the rural. We had the Cork Declaration, Salzburg Declaration of over 10 years, almost 10 years ago now, talking about a living countryside. What kind of a vision do we have for this region and for these communities post-2013 as we come into the major reforms of rural development policy and agriculture policy in Europe? So to conclude, what works well? What do we want more of? Micro-regional approaches, where communities work with the neighbouring communities. And I'm a card-carrying member of the GAA, and yes, we have rivalries between parishes and teams, on the pitch. But off the pitch, we need to work together. This Mehel idea. And we need to do that at a local level. Because our county boundaries that haven't changed, apart from a few exceptions around Dublin, since 1899, are very much outdated. We need to work with community catchment areas, the micro-regions. We need to support civil society at local level. We need to invest in the social economy, and I've given you some examples of the projects there. If we look at regions such as Bavaria and Germany, or Emilia-Romagna, North Central Italy, that consistently have the lowest levels of unemployment in Europe, they have a very well-developed social economy, our third sector, where community businesses provide jobs and deliver services at local level. We need to invest in supporting volunteerism, facilitate, animate, that is to encourage new participants, and of course then to reach out to all members of communities. We need decentralized management. The decisions are made at a local level. We need to have the local working in partnership with local authorities, with statutory bodies, all working together. What has worked well also is the support the European Union has given. Most of the funding that civil society and community and voluntary groups have accessed was and has been European Union funding, whether it's LEADER, Partnership, Interreg, Peace and Reconciliation. The EU is getting a bad press at the moment, and there are reasons for that. But from a community development perspective, the European Union has certainly led the way in terms of support for bottom-up development in Ireland. Our own state has been much more tardy in that respect. And transnational cooperation, collaboration with other rural communities, and great scope in this respect for doing that with Canada. So we need to improve local inputs into regional and national policy. We certainly need to formalise the community action that we have and turn that into a municipal tier of government, so that Buncrana has a body, a council, that has real teeth and can make real decisions for this town and for its hinterland. We need to clarify the role of local government and distinguish that from the role of local development. The idea that local councils can subsume the civil society and subsume partnerships and leader groups is a fallacy. They are distinctive. Community needs to be able to be independent of the state as well so that it can critique it. We need to avoid then annualisation, this short-term planning. So much of what communities do can be, their time can be taken up with planning and, having to reapply for funding every year. Then, from a public sector perspective, we need agencies to work together, not to have this silo mentality, each minding its own patch. And clearly, this is not going to be a big bang. It's going to be progressive. It's going to happen over time. And yes, with any reform process, there will be mistakes along the way. But I have every confidence in the community and voluntary sector and people like Don McNeill and those of you, the other leaders of civil society here, that you will make a long-term success of this. Go to Míle maith agaibh.